And good morning. This is Paul Gibbons. Hi. Zhao Shanghao, I think you say in Chinese. Very nice to be here. And I want to thank Ella for all her incredible hard work in organizing this. So today we're going to talk a little bit about happiness. And I've got a lot to say, but first, just a little bit about me. I do public speaking. I'm a university professor sometimes. I lived in London most of my life. I compete on the national stage in poker, chess, backgammon, esports. I do not compete in CrossFit. I'm 60 years old, and that's not a picture of me, but that's one of the things I try to do to keep myself uh, uh, fit. So, welcome and good morning to everybody. So my latest book is called The Spirituality of Work and Leadership. And when I've said that to people that I'm writing a book on the spirituality of business, they often say to me that will be a very short book. But in fact, it's turned out to be a very long book. I've split it into two volumes, and volume one is out in 3 weeks. And today I'm going to talk about volume one only, which is both very personal, but when we get to the topic of leadership, we're going to find that it has a lot of relationship to business. And so, one of the things that when you're a young person and you're living in a dormitory at university, you'll sit up late at night and you'll have these great conversations we all remember about the meaning of life. So, what is the meaning of life? It's been discussed for at least 4,000 years in literature. It's certainly something that the main Abrahamic religions talk about. It's a topic that Eastern religions talk about. It's talked about in science fiction. It's talked about in contemporary culture. And so let's talk a little bit about the meaning of life here. So, is it happiness? Uh, a very large number of thinkers, both of old and of new, think that happiness is the goal of the good life. So let's talk about why that might be true or not true and what the consequences of thinking about happiness are. First of all, our culture, I apologize, this is from the West, we're invited to compare not just how we look but how we feel with how people look. You know, you see best-selling authors on happiness and these conference gurus beaming with success. And the problem with that is when you make that comparison, as we know, our life happiness goes up and down. We are not, I don't know anybody who's happy all the time. And we're invited to compare ourselves with people that seem to be so. And the cost of that is that we're always on. We are in our working lives and sometimes in our family lives and our social lives expected to display, expected to feel, expected to look as if we are living the dream, as people say in the United States. And the fact of the matter is that as we cycle through the ups and downs of moods in our life, sometimes we'll be sad, sometimes we'll be lonely, sometimes we'll be angry, sometimes we may feel a little bit depressed. Comparing ourselves with how we ought to feel, the way other people look, comparing our inside life, our interior life, with people's outside can be very injurious. In fact, it can make the low feelings lower because we feel there's something fundamentally wrong. We are missing a key ingredient of the pot of life that's going to make us feel the way we think we ought to feel. And so there are costs to this. There are other costs to thinking about happiness. So comparison isn't your friend, as we've said, but from the Greek writers from 2,500 years ago, aiming at happiness, thinking about happiness, means that you miss it. It's a paradox. In the West, particularly the United States culture, we're invited to think that you set a goal and you set out to achieve the goal. And the paradox of happiness is if you set out to make yourself happy, it's pretty much a guarantee that you will not be happy. Happiness is the product of the good life and not the aim. So you live a good life, and again, the paradox is that you will feel, on good days, happier as a result of living a good life. what we find is that it's not the big things in life, research shows, that make people happy. It's the small things, a hug, the smell and the sip of the first cup of coffee, the sound Netflix makes when your favorite show starts, the excitement of a spine cracking on a new book, cooking a meal, watching small children play outside. It's the small, almost sensual pleasures that lead us to be happiness. We also need to know that happiness is partly genetic. When twin studies are done, two twins, genetically identical, obviously, raised apart in different environments, urban or rural or rich or poor, what we find is an extraordinary correlation between their disposition and how happy they are, their assessments of life satisfaction. So that's an interesting thing. If you think you should be happier, it's wise to remember that it is, to some extent, part of your genetic makeup. And what we also find is something that will be disappointing to all of the people who are advocates of consumerism and overconsumption in the West, is very little to do with money. Spending money and earning money and how much money you have was studied by economists, mostly in the last century. And one of the interesting things is, this applies to countries as well, is that happiness and wealth are largely uncorrelated. Now, that's not true if you're very poor or if you're eking out an existence. Then a little bit of money can make you quite a lot happier. But once you reach a certain level of comfort, economists tell us, it doesn't improve your level of happiness. In fact, what's more is that the very, very well off seem to have slightly lower levels of happiness. Isn't that an extraordinary thing? So what is the meaning of life? So if it's not happiness, then is it caring for people and living according to the Tao? Is it what the Greeks suggested? The virtuous life is living in accordance with high principles. The Romans valued valor and courage. The Epicurean Greeks valued pleasure and hedonism. Humanists value social justice. The Romantic poets and romantics throughout history have talked about the importance of love as the meaning of life. And nature spirituality talks about caring for the biosphere. So which from all of that menu are we going to pick today in the 21st century? Well, I'm going to talk about some experiments from philosophy first. You've all seen, I hope, The Matrix. If you haven't seen The Matrix, you need to get out more. But there's a famous scene in The Matrix where Cypher is about to betray his friends. And he's in the Matrix looking at a piece of steak, and he says, I know this piece of steak is fake. And I know it tastes juicy, and that's fake too. But you know what I've discovered in life, he said, Cypher? He says that ignorance is bliss. He wants to be in the Matrix and have all these pseudo pleasures. And a Harvard philosopher, Robert Nozick, did a similar thought experiment. Is people were asked whether they would get inside a pleasure machine, a machine designed to simulate real life experiences so you couldn't tell the difference. Would you get into the machine? And here's the answer. Unlike Cypher, most people say no. It's not that we just want to feel things in life. We want to feel our own agency. We want to do things. We want to be purposefully directed. And so it's an interesting question for you. I mean, ask yourself the question, would you jump in the pleasure machine and have this simulated in life? And if your answer is no, as it is for most people, then why? And so, 1940s, Abraham Maslow came along. This model is really hated by psychologists, but it's really loved by everybody else. But he began to talk about depth psychology. What we want in life is just not happy experiences. We want depth. And he talked a little bit about self-actualization. He's most famous for the hierarchy of needs, although he revised his thinking on this much later in the 1960s, 70s. It's just sad that this is the only part of his legacy that, in a sense, survives in popular culture. Because actually his thought on this was much more sophisticated and aligned with what I'm about to talk about, some ideas from spirituality as we continue. And so let's do a thought experiment about the object of the good life. So
does caring for a sick friend, making great sacrifice, make you happy? Does being an activist and striving for good in the world, does it make you happy? Does summiting a mountain or achieving great things, perhaps at great risk to yourself, does that make you happy while you're enduring the hardships of climbing Everest, for example? Does serving your country in the military, does a soldier doing their duty, are they happy? Are people who achieve high levels of excellence in their profession, that's Magnus Carlsen, the undisputed world chess champion? And the answer is, I don't think that's why they do what they do. I don't think that's what motivates them. So what does motivate these people? Why care for people? Why do your duty as a soldier? Why fight for good in the world? Why go on to achieve great things in the world? And the answer, which is again from Greek psychology, from Greek philosophy, about 2,500 years ago, but was reactivated by positive psychologists in the 1980s and 1990s. One of them's a fellow bridge player, Martin Seligman's very famous for this work, and it's called human flourishing. And what I've developed, it's an extension of Martin Seligman's work, is a model of human flourishing at work. And so it's hard to read, but you can see spiritual fulfillment as having purpose and meaning in your life as part of that. Engagement, feeling that you're stretched to the maximum of your talents, is part of human flourishing. Nurturing relationships, being able to care for people and feeling cared for by people, is part of flourishing. And so that's the example that caring for a sick friend is certainly explained by some of this model. Achieving big things. We're human beings. I start my book with a talk about human beings 100,000 years ago, when we were living very primitively. And if you were to think about how, in just a blink of an evolutionary eye, we've gone from living in very primitive circumstances to sending starships to conquer other worlds, that never happened before. If you think about it, a shark from 100,000 years ago is still a shark, and they're more or less identical. And that's the same with most mammals. But human beings, well, no. And so how did we do that is really an interesting question. And then part, obviously, of human flourishment is positive affect, happiness, in a more simple word, optimism, anticipating the future, and happiness. And so to save your trip to BuzzFeed, as I always said, I don't know how many of you in the East do these silly quizzes on BuzzFeed. Which Game of Thrones character are you? Which Stranger Things character are you? Well, this is slightly more practical than that, and that's a quiz you can find on my website, Human Flourishing at Work. You can actually go through and perhaps try to identify areas for yourself that you think might be missing in some of the dimensions that we talked about. But the problem with happiness, and the problem with depth psychology from Maslow, and the problem even with human flourishing, I'm talking about an evolution in thought. And so this is an evolution over time about how we've come to think about the good life, meaning in life, in a more sophisticated way. All of those are still all about you. And in my opinion, and in the opinion of many other scholars and theologians, the more stuff is about you, the less likely you are to be happy. And so Maslow and flourishing are still very much dedicated to the self. When you self-actualize for you. When you find meaning in life, it's your meaning, not collective meaning. And when you achieve in life, if you achieve great things for yourself, it's not for the good of the world. So what can we learn from that? We come to more sophisticated models than Maslow and human flourishing of the good life, the meaningful life for human beings. So let's go back to our ancestors here to think, what did they do? What magic did we have? Because if you'd been a gambler from another planet, from another species, observing the savannah, observing all of the mammals in Africa 100,000 years ago, and you'd have seen these guys here. They don't have big fangs. They don't have. They're not fast or as strong. They're not as strong as the apes or as fast as the cheetahs. They're not as well defended as the predator as the prey. They don't have natural defenses. We're actually very vulnerable and very soft. So how did we who would you have bet on? Well, I'd have bet on the lions or the great apes or the dinosaurs myself if I was trying to think about who would have dominion over the entire planet. But that's not what happened. So why? So why us? How did we get here? When, as I said, zebras are still zebras, and they still live in a little corner of Africa. You don't find them in the rainforest. You don't find them in Antarctica. You don't find them sending starships. How did we do that? And some ways that we did it is, first of all, for survival, we learned to work together. We worked together so that our band of human beings, didn't matter how big the ape was or how fast the cheetah was, we were able to triumph. We, because of our sophisticated thinking apparatus, we are able to imagine fictional realities. Now that sounds like something that we do every day, we imagine, but as far as we know, we are the only species on the planet who can create fictions and imagined realities in our head. But what does that allow us to do? It allows us to see a potential world that doesn't exist. It allows us to imagine how things could be and not just viscerally, sensually experience how things are. And that ends up being very, very powerful because it allows us metacognition. We can make abstractions. So in ordinary mammals, we can say, oh, watch out, that's a tiger. But we can talk about possible tigers, families of tigers. There were tigers here last week. There could be tigers here because this is a watering hole. We can create abstractions that allow us to plan and predict and begin to anticipate, manage risks, and to deliver on these imagined realities. We also find we're a very playful species. Now you think, well, so what? We play, other animals do. We've seen kittens play and something like that. But human playfulness is excessive. Now, why is that to do with survival of our species? Because when you play, you're in a sense doing sort of these mini scientific experiments. So when a lioness kills a gazelle, she's not playing with the antlers to see, oh, I could make a weapon of these. She's not playing with the skin to see, oh, I could make a covering to keep my children warm. When other animals kill fish, they don't say, oh, well, let's take the fish bones to make needles so that we can sew a net to catch more. That all of that playfulness and curiosity allowed us to be inventive, new tools, new ways of living. And so, new habitats, it allowed us to develop agriculture. So a lot of the inventiveness and imagination of human beings is because we play and are curious. And also, of course, as you know, we're capable of symbolic thought, things such as art and math, particularly, and obviously language. So these are the things, these are human superpowers. Now, we live in a world where artificial intelligence has a great promise or a great threat. We need to think about superpowers because we're not ever going to be as strong as a robot. We're not going to be as precise as a robot. We're not going to be able to out-crunch a computer in thinking, but we need to think about what we are good at that machines are not good at in order to continue to fulfill our purpose, because they're going to replace a lot of the stuff that's rote. So there's a little bit on artificial intelligence and the ethics of artificial intelligence for you. And so one of the dimensions I think that's incredible is mastery when we think about the meaning of life. Now, why is that important? If you think about Roger Bannister, who was the first person to run an under 4-minute mile. A mile is about 2 kilometers, give or take. That was thought to be a theoretically impossible good job, and people had spent almost half a century until the 1950s trying to beat the 4-minute mile. Nobody had done it. Roger Bannister did it. And since he did it, now high school students break 4-minute miles. So once he did it, there was an avalanche of people. He pushed back the boundaries of human achievement. And he didn't just do it for Roger. He did it for all of us. He showed us what we're capable of. And so that is what I think is inspirational about mastery. Now, here are some great things. There are great architecture, the Burj Khalifa. There are great humanitarians such as Desmond Tutu. There are great footballers. There are great scholars. There are great people that are mastering of the competitive domain, such as chess. There are the Human Genome Project. There are the most incredible male ballerina that's ever lived. I believe that's Baryshnikov and not Nureyev. These feats of mastery, I think, distinguish us as human beings. And people say, well, oh, it's all about the self there, but it's not, because I know high performers in almost every domain, and I'll tell you what, they're not ego-free. There's a fantasy anyway, nobody is really ego-free. But what's absolutely special about them is the love of the craft. They aren't driven by ego, they aren't driven by fame, they aren't driven by money. But to get to the highest level in whatever you do, you have to love the thing for the thing's sake. You have to, if you imagine children who become great chess players or dancers or something like that, you have to live and breathe that as a young person. And you're not doing it to make mom and dad happy. You're doing it because you love the thing so much. And that's what's important about mastery, that love of the thing in itself. And so I think it's much nobler and much more important than happiness as a way to think about life. And then the Greeks also offered us something else, the Transcendentals, truth, beauty, and goodness. That's Plato's Academy. That's the Lotus building in China, I believe it's in Shanghai. And that's Doctors Without Borders, truth, beauty, and goodness are the other dimension, I think, of the good life. And there's still too little in the world. The highest performing stock in the last 100 years is what? It makes cigarettes. It's Altria. We're still focused on that, not goodness. There's still too much ugliness. We still throw together buildings and offices and social housing that looks disgusting, but we can do better. There are beautiful offices, there are beautiful places to shop, and there are beautiful places you can build for people to live. We still destroy nature. You know, it's kind of funny, if you visit someone's house and you live there, perhaps they're not there, an acceptable moral standard is leaving it better than you found it. Yeah, at least as good, but not better. We don't think about the planet that way. We don't think of ourselves as visiting this thing. Can I leave this biosphere, this habitat better than I found it? Because today, we just destroy it. I mean, we just, whatever it might be, it's a river, a stream, it's the atmosphere, wherever it is, we don't think about, can I leave this better? It would be a great thing, and a thing that we fail to achieve, to just not kill it off, just not destroy it. And then, of course, you know, leaders today, many leaders, I won't mention any names, have a very, very difficult relationship with the truth. So I think we're still a long ways from truth, beauty, and goodness in society and in business and even, you know, dare I say, in pursuit of our own lives. And so the greatest human challenges, I think, are ending hunger, finding universal education, gender equality, child mortality, maternal deaths, combating disease, environmental sustainability, and leading globally. And those aren't my invention. Those are called the Millennial Development Goals. And actually, I want to say, I can give a shout out to humanity, and that though we didn't check every box, enormous progress has been made on those since they were first conceived. And those have evolved into the Sustainable Development Goals, which are a bit bigger and a bit broader. Now you say, oh, well, what has that got to do with business? And what has that got to do with business leadership? There are companies, particularly European companies, two I can think of, Unilever and Shell, who put these at the core of their strategy. So how do you do that if you're an oil company? How do you put gender equality, ending poverty? It is that you measure yourself. And so they have a report on their performance, on how they're contributing to these things, trying to leave these things, again, a little better at the end of the day than they were at the beginning of the day through their activities. And we need more businesses that think like that. And so that takes us to one of our final topics. Is going to be leadership. Is how do we get there? And one of the great Chinese philosophers, Mencius, said, Never has a man who bent himself has been able to make others straight. And first, work on yourself. Find meaning, purpose, truth, beauty, goodness, mastery for yourself. Do that inner work. And what the wonderful thing is about spirituality that you might discover if you read my book is what's that got to do with leadership. One of the things is umbrellas the inner work that one does on oneself with having meaningful outer purpose in the world. And so I think it's really a fabulous idea that we can think more about in workplaces. Inner work without outer purpose is narcissism. You're just trying to make yourself feel good or self-improve without thinking about how you make a difference in the world. And outer purpose, trying to do things in the world without developing yourself, I think is futile. So those are some leadership lessons. And some of the other leadership lessons that I spend time on the book is, I won't spend a lot of time on it. I could spend about an hour talking about this model I developed in the middle of the 1990s, but it's an integral leadership model that captures that inner work and outer purpose dimension. And the other thing that I think is really important is accountability as a leadership tool, as a leadership concept. You know, you see leaders, there's one in my own country where I live in the United States right now, who, as soon as something goes wrong, seeks to blame everyone else in the world. His team, the opposite political party, loves to blame China. All of Americans' problems somehow were birthed in China. He's the great victim. He's not even accountable for himself, for his own behaviors. Never mind the accountable for the behaviors of his team or his organization or his country, and Lord knows he's not accountable for any big human important goals. And so I spent a lot of time talking about a model I've developed for accountable leadership in the book. But it's a counterintuitive topic because we're not taught when we are young accountability for everyone around us. My accountability is for everybody around me to prosper, not just for me getting an A on this particular test. Anyway, it's a big concept. I think it's an important concept, and I think you'll enjoy it if you dive into the book. And so too much leadership, too much of the way we think about leadership today is still about power over. And another really important model from the book is the will to serve. I stole this from Friedrich Nietzsche, the 19th century German philosopher. The will to serve versus the will to control. And too much leadership today is still about having power over people. And so why I wrote the book is what I think spirituality can do for us individually and for business and for the world is we can aim higher at our noblest goals, perhaps the Sustainable Development Goals. We can work on developing human superpowers such as mastery. We use reason, systems thinking, and science and not mythology because that is a human superpower. A human superpower is our higher cognitive faculties. It's worth remembering that. We can focus on the eternals, the transcendentals, the truth, beauty, and goodness, and we can lead with humility, accountability, and compassion. And so that's why I write. That's why I write the books I write. My mantra is better leaders for better businesses for a better world. Some of my books are on behavioral science and change. They have very, very heavy science focus. My most recent one is on spirituality, work in leadership, but there's an awful lot of science and philosophy in there. So it's not just spiritual wisdom, but also from the great philosophers of old. And so that